The sun had barely kissed the horizon when Clara McKinnon stepped out of the modest wooden cabin, her bare feet meeting the cool earth of the Wyoming Territory. The year was 1882, and at 17 she had known nothing but the rhythm of shepherding life, the gentle bleating of sheep, her father's weathered hands guiding her through daily chores, and the endless expanse of prairie grass that stretched beyond the rolling hills. "Clara, mind the eastern pasture today," called out Thomas McKinnon, her father, as he adjusted his worn leather suspenders. His Scottish accent, though softened by years in America, still colored his words with the music of the highlands. "The rains last week made the grass rich there. The flock will be content." "Yes, Pa," Clara replied, tying her auburn hair back with a simple ribbon. She watched as her father's border collie, Fergus, circled the sheep with practiced precision. The dog's black and white coat gleamed in the morning light as he guided the woolly creatures toward their grazing grounds. The McKinnon homestead sat in a valley blessed with natural springs and protected by low hills. Thomas had chosen this spot carefully when he'd claimed the land 5 years earlier, after Clara's mother had died of consumption back in Pennsylvania. Here, they could raise sheep safely, sell wool to the trading posts, and live quietly away from the chaos of gold rushes and cattle wars that plagued other parts of the territory. Clara picked up her wicker basket, the same one her mother had used for gathering herbs. "I'll collect some wildflowers for the cabin, Pa. The meadow by Willow Creek should have plenty blooming now." Thomas nodded approvingly. "Aye, your mother always said flowers brought life into a home. Just stay within sight of the flock, lass. There's been talk of drifters moving through these parts." As Clara made her way across the dew-laden grass, she reflected on her simple but fulfilling life. She could read and write. Her father had insisted on that much education, and she helped with every aspect of their small operation. From shearing sheep to spinning wool, from tending their vegetable garden to bartering with traveling merchants, Clara had grown into a capable young woman with calloused hands and a keen understanding of frontier life. The sheep grazed peacefully, their gentle sounds mixing with the whisper of wind through prairie grass. Clara hummed a Scottish lullaby her mother used to sing, her voice carrying across the open landscape. She felt connected to this land, to its harsh beauty and honest demands. This was her world, predictable and secure. But as she approached Willow Creek, basket in hand, Clara had no idea that her simple morning routine was about to shatter the peaceful boundaries of everything she had ever known. Willow Creek meandered through the valley like a silver ribbon, fed by mountain springs and bordered by cottonwoods and wild roses. Clara had been coming to this spot since they'd settled here. It was where the most beautiful wildflowers bloomed, where she could sit quietly and watch the water flow over smooth stones. This morning, the air carried the scent of wet earth and blooming prairie sage. Clara knelt among clusters of purple lupine and golden black-eyed Susans, carefully selecting the most vibrant blooms for her basket. The creek bubbled softly beside her, and she could hear meadowlarks calling from the grasslands behind her. It was then that she noticed the tracks. At first, Clara thought they might belong to deer coming to drink, but as she looked more closely, her breath caught. These were boot prints, human tracks pressed deep into the soft mud at the creek's edge. But what made her heart race wasn't just the presence of strangers. It was what the tracks revealed. The prints were small, delicate. Some were bare feet, others worn thin shoes, and there were so many of them leading both up and down the creek bank. Clara counted at least 8 or 9 different sets of prints, all roughly her size or smaller. Her hands trembling slightly, Clara followed the tracks downstream, her flower gathering forgotten. Behind a bend in the creek, partially hidden by a fallen cottonwood, she discovered something that made her gasp. Scattered along the shore were scraps of fabric, torn pieces of dresses in faded blue and brown calico, a child's small boot with the sole coming loose, and most disturbing of all, lengths of rope that had been cut or frayed, as if someone had worked desperately to free themselves. Clara's mind raced. She had heard whispered conversations between her father and other settlers about troubling rumors, stories of young women disappearing from isolated homesteads, tales of unscrupulous men who preyed on vulnerable families. But those had seemed like distant fears, not something that could touch their peaceful valley. As she knelt by the debris, Clara heard something that made her freeze. Voices carried on the wind, coming from upstream. Men's voices, rough and urgent. "Told you to keep them quiet during the crossing. Next settlement is 2 days' ride. We can't afford. That girl with the red hair keeps trying to run. Tie her feet next time." Clara's blood turned to ice. Without thinking, she pressed herself flat against the muddy bank, hidden by the overhanging willows. Through the curtain of green branches, she could see 3 men on horseback approaching the creek. They led a covered wagon, and from within it came the unmistakable sounds of muffled crying. The men looked exactly like what her father had warned her about, drifters with hard eyes and unkempt beards, wearing dusty clothes and carrying themselves with the casual violence of those who took what they wanted. The leader, a man with a distinctive scar across his left cheek, dismounted and began filling his canteen. "We'll water the horses here and move on," he said. "The next stop is Miller's Crossing. We've got buyers waiting." Clara realized with horror what she was witnessing. These men weren't just thieves or cattle rustlers. They were trafficking people. Young women stolen from their homes and being transported like cargo to some terrible fate. As quietly as she could manage, Clara began backing away through the willows, her heart pounding so hard she was sure it could be heard over the creek's bubbling. She had to get back to her father, had to warn him, had to... A twig snapped under her foot. The scarred man's head whipped around. What was that? Clara pressed herself deeper into the shadows, not daring to breathe. Through the wagon's canvas covering, she could see movement, the silhouettes of several young women, bound and terrified. "Probably just an animal," one of the other men said. "Let's keep moving." But the scarred man wasn't satisfied. He began walking toward the willows, his hand resting on his gun. Clara closed her eyes and prayed that her father's lessons about moving quietly in the wilderness would save her now. She had stumbled upon something evil, something that threatened not just her own safety, but the safety of every family in the territory. As the footsteps grew closer, Clara made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't just run home and hope these men would pass by. Those women in the wagon needed help, and she might be their only chance. But first, she had to survive the next few minutes. The scarred man stopped just feet from Clara's hiding place, so close she could smell tobacco and unwashed clothing. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she pressed her face into the damp earth, willing herself to become invisible among the willow roots. "Jake, we ain't got time for your paranoia," called one of his companions. "Sun's getting high, and we promised Sutton we'd be in Miller's Crossing by nightfall." After what felt like an eternity, the scarred man, Jake, spat into the creek and turned back to his horse. "Yeah, all right, but something don't feel right about this place." Clara remained motionless until the sound of hoofbeats and wagon wheels faded completely. Only then did she allow herself to breathe properly, her whole body shaking with fear and adrenaline. She had narrowly escaped discovery, but the weight of what she had witnessed pressed down on her like a physical burden. Those women in the wagon, they were someone's daughters, sisters, maybe wives, and they were being taken somewhere terrible, somewhere they might never return from. Clara gathered her scattered wildflowers with trembling hands, her mind racing. She had to tell her father, but she also knew that by the time they could organize any kind of rescue, the wagon would be long gone. Miller's Crossing was a rough settlement 2 days north, known for its saloons, gambling halls, and the kind of men who asked no questions about where money came from. The walk back to the cabin felt longer than usual. Every shadow seemed threatening. Every sound made her jump. The peaceful valley that had always felt like sanctuary now seemed exposed and vulnerable. Clara realized how naive she had been to think that evil would simply pass them by because they kept to themselves. When she reached the homestead, she found her father mending a section of fence while Fergus watched over the grazing flock. Thomas took one look at his daughter's pale face and set down his tools. "Clara, lass, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Pa, I need to tell you something, and you're not going to like it." Clara's voice was steadier than she felt. She had inherited her father's practical nature, and she forced herself to report what she had seen clearly and completely. Thomas listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each detail. When Clara finished, he was silent for a long moment, staring out at the hills that suddenly seemed less like protection and more like isolation. "Human trafficking," he said finally, the words bitter in his mouth. "I'd hoped such evil would never find its way to our valley." He looked at his daughter with a mixture of pride and worry. "You did well to stay hidden, Clara. Those men would have killed you without a second thought. But Pa, those women, we have to do something. We can't just let them disappear." Thomas ran a hand through his graying hair. "What can we do? It's just you and me against armed men with a head start. By the time we could ride to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne, they'd be long gone, probably sold to—" He couldn't finish the sentence. Clara felt frustration and helplessness wash over her. "So we do nothing? We just go back to tending sheep while those women suffer?" "I didn't say we'd do nothing," Thomas said firmly. "But we have to be smart about it. These men aren't just common thieves, Clara. They're part of something organized, something dangerous. If we make the wrong move, we could end up dead, and those women would be no better off." Father and daughter stood in the growing afternoon heat, the weight of moral obligation heavy between them. Clara had always respected her father's wisdom, but for the first time in her life, she wondered if caution might be another word for cowardice. That evening, as they sat at their simple wooden table, eating a dinner of mutton stew and bread, Thomas made an announcement that surprised Clara. "Tomorrow, we're going into town. Not Cheyenne, that's too far, but there's a sheriff's deputy in Riverside, about 6 hours' ride. We'll report what you saw and let the law handle it." Clara nodded, but she could see the doubt in her father's eyes. They both knew that frontier justice was often slow, sometimes corrupt, and frequently ineffective. By the time any official response was organized, the trail would be cold. As Clara lay in her narrow bed that night, listening to the wind whistle through the cabin's chinks, she made a decision that would have terrified her parents and probably saved lives. She wasn't going to wait for the law to act slowly and cautiously. She was going to follow that wagon herself. The gentle shepherd's daughter had seen evil with her own eyes, and she was no longer content to tend flowers while others suffered. Tomorrow, while her father made the long ride to Riverside, Clara would take their fastest horse and follow the trail to Miller's Crossing. It was the most dangerous decision of her young life, and perhaps the most necessary. Clara woke before dawn, her heart already racing with the weight of her decision. She dressed quietly in her most practical clothes, her brother's old pants, kept for the roughest farm work, a sturdy shirt, and her father's spare hat to hide her distinctive red hair. She moved through the cabin like a ghost, gathering supplies, jerky, hardtack, her father's spare revolver, and the small amount of money they kept hidden in a coffee tin. Thomas was still asleep, exhausted from a sleepless night of worry. Clara left him a note that she knew would both explain and devastate him. "Pa, gone to Miller's Crossing to help those women. Can't stand by while evil wins. If I don't come back, know that I love you and am proud to be your daughter. Take care of Fergus and the flock." Clara. She saddled Thunder, their fastest horse, as quietly as possible. The gelding was used to her touch and remained calm as she secured her supplies. In the pre-dawn darkness, Clara McKinnon rode north, following the trail the traffickers had taken the day before. The landscape changed as she traveled. The gentle rolling hills of their valley gave way to rougher terrain, scarred by mining claims and dotted with the remains of failed homesteads. This was harder country, where the wind cut sharper and the sun showed no mercy. Clara had never traveled so far alone, but her father had taught her well. She followed the wagon tracks, pausing frequently to read the signs the way Thomas had shown her: broken branches, hoof prints, places where the heavy wagon had gotten stuck and been pushed free. The trail led steadily north toward Miller's Crossing. By midday, Clara could see smoke on the horizon. Miller's Crossing had started as a mining camp during the gold rush of '79, but when the easy gold played out, it had transformed into a different kind of opportunity, a place where legitimate business mixed with activities that couldn't survive in more civilized settlements. Clara approached carefully, leaving Thunder tied in a grove of trees about a mile from town. She needed to scout the situation before taking any action. From a hillside overlooking the main street, she could see the settlement spread below her, a collection of rough buildings, a few permanent structures, and the temporary feel of a place where people came to make quick money and disappear. It didn't take long to spot the wagon. It was parked behind what looked like a saloon and boarding house, guarded by one of the men she had seen at the creek. Clara's blood ran cold as she realized the women were probably being held inside, waiting to be sold to whoever had the money to buy human beings. For the first time since leaving home, Clara felt the full weight of her youth and inexperience. What had seemed like righteous determination in the safety of her father's cabin now felt like dangerous foolishness. She was one 17-year-old girl against hardened criminals in their own territory. But as she watched, she saw something that hardened her resolve. A young woman, probably not much older than herself, was being dragged from the wagon toward the building. The woman had red hair like Clara's, and even from a distance, Clara could see her desperate attempt to resist her captors. Clara thought of her mother, who had taught her that sometimes doing the right thing required risking everything. She thought of her father, who had always said that character was what you did when no one was watching and when the cost was high. As the sun began to set over Miller's Crossing, Clara McKinnon made her final preparations. She couldn't overpower these men, and she couldn't outrun them, but she could be smarter than them. She had spent her life learning to move quietly, to observe without being seen, to understand the patterns of animals and humans alike. That night, Clara would attempt something that would either save those women or get them all killed. But the gentle shepherd's daughter had seen too much to turn back now. The wildflowers she had picked yesterday morning seemed like relics from another life, symbols of an innocence that was gone forever. As darkness fell over the rough frontier town, Clara began to move. She had become something her father never intended to raise, a young woman willing to face evil directly, whatever the cost. The daughter of a shepherd had found her courage by a river, and now she would discover whether that courage was enough to change the fate of strangers who had become more important to her than her own safety.